Today, we dive into a maritime disaster led by the last man fit to command. July 2nd, 1816. Off the coast of West Africa, the French naval frigate Méduse has just run aground on a treacherous sandbank. For the 400 people on board, this is the beginning of one of the most horrifying survival stories in maritime history. The tragedy that followed is not just a tale of a shipwreck, but of incompetence, betrayal, and unimaginable desperation on the open sea. A few weeks earlier, the Méduse had departed Rochefort, France, on what should have been a routine voyage. Its captain, Viscount Hugues du Roy de Chaumareix, was a man who had scarcely sailed in 20 years. A royalist émigré returned after the Napoleonic Wars. He obtained this command thanks to political favor rather than skill. Eager to impress his superiors, Chaumareix led the Méduse far ahead of the other ships in their convoy, carrying the newly appointed French governor of Senegal, along with his wife and daughter, and soldiers to re-establish French control in West Africa. It was a crucial mission, but the ship's leadership was alarmingly unqualified. As the Méduse neared the African coast, Chaumareix's poor judgment proved disastrous. He had permitted an inexperienced passenger, a self-styled philosopher named Rochefort, to act as the ship's navigator in blatant violation of naval regulations. This amateur mistook a distant cloud bank for Cape Blanco on the horizon, a ghastly error that sent the Méduse nearly 100 miles off course into uncharted shallows. By the time the crew realized something was wrong, it was too late. On the afternoon of July 2nd, 1816, lookouts saw the water turn a pale brown and surf breaking ahead. Signs of a reef dead ahead. Moments later came a grinding, sickening crunch. The Méduse slammed into a sandbank off the coast of Mauritania. The mighty frigate shuddered to a halt, impaled in the mud. Chaos erupted on deck. The officers desperately tried to free the ship. Orders were shouted, men heaved cargo overboard. But the Méduse was stuck fast. Captain Chaumareix refused to lighten the load by dumping the ship's heavy cannons, a critical mistake that only dug the frigate deeper into the sand. For 2 days, they clung to hope that the rising tide or sheer effort might pry them loose. Instead, on July 5th, a gale began to swell the seas. Waves battered the stranded ship and started breaking her apart. The timbers groaned and seawater seeped through the hull. Fearing the Méduse would soon be torn to pieces, Chaumareix finally gave the order to abandon ship. The crew and passengers scrambled to evacuate. The Méduse had only 6 lifeboats, nowhere near enough for everyone on board. Originally, the plan was to ferry people to shore in 2 trips, and even construct a small raft for cargo to lighten the ship. But in the panic of the moment, that careful plan was thrown out the window. Instead, the officers concocted a desperate solution: build a single giant raft to carry all those who could not fit in the boats, and have the boats tow it to land. It sounded just plausible enough in theory. And so, amid yelling and haste, they began lashing together masts, yards, and planks into a makeshift super raft. In the rush to escape, this massive raft took shape.
Excellent!
The crew grimly nicknamed it La Machine. When the time came, at least 147 people, 146 men, and 1 woman were piled onto the wooden platform. It immediately sagged under their weight, half submerged and alarmingly unstable. There were no sails, no oars, no rudder, not even a proper deck, just a fragile lattice of timbers, barely afloat. Tellingly, 17 crewmen refused to board the raft at all, choosing to remain on the wreck of the Méduse, in hopes of later rescue. On that fateful day, the Méduse's survivors cast off in 2 groups. In the 6 lifeboats went the captain, Governor Schmaltz and his family, and the most fortunate 250 or so people. Everyone else crowded onto the raft, which was tethered by a rope to the boats. As the convoy set out for the African coast, the raft immediately proved almost impossible to tow. It dragged and swerved, threatening to swamp the lifeboats. After only a few kilometers, the officers in the boats made a chilling decision. The raft had to be cut loose. In their view, freeing themselves of the raft's weight was the only chance the boats had to reach shore. And so, in an act of stunning betrayal, they slashed the tow ropes and abandoned the raft to drift away on the open ocean. They watched the lifelines go slack and begin to slip away. Desperate, the men and women on the raft cried out, "Vive le roi," long live the king, hoping a surge of patriotism might tug at the hearts of their countrymen in the boats. They begged for mercy. It was no use. The lifeboats continued rowing into the distance, carrying the captain and the governor, along with crates of supplies, even the governor's personal luggage and wine, and leaving roughly 150 souls to fend for themselves in the vast Atlantic. The boats weren't even filled to capacity, but when a few despairing people tried to swim after them and climb aboard, they were met with drawn swords and kicked back into the sea. In that moment, the people on the raft knew they had been truly, utterly forsaken. And so began a nightmare drift that would last 13 days. Day 1 on the raft. Nearly 150 castaways packed shoulder to shoulder under a blistering tropical sun, desperate to stay afloat. Their provisions were almost nil. In the chaos of evacuation, most of the supplies had been lost or thrown overboard by mistake, including nearly all the fresh water. A single bag of ship's biscuits had been tossed toward the raft at the last minute, but it missed and fell into the sea. Sailors managed to fish it out, only to find the biscuits turned to pulp by salt water. They scraped up the mush to eat, but it barely filled a few mouths. By sunset of the first day, essentially all that remained for 147 people was a few casks of wine. Under the sweltering sun, dehydration set in quickly. Paradoxically, the wine only made their thirst worse. Fear, anger, and despair hung over the raft as the horizon glowed red with the coming night. Almost immediately, the raft descended into chaos. With no officers left in charge and everyone on edge, tempers flared. Fights broke out, some spurred by drunken confusion, others by raw desperation. A rift formed between groups. A number of soldiers and sailors banded together on one side, while some remaining officers and passengers clustered on the other. As darkness fell on that first night, things turned from panicked to hellish. Some men, including the governor's secretary, who had been denied a spot in the boats, simply gave up hope. He leapt into the sea in despair, not once, but twice, and had to be hauled back each time. Others reached a breaking point of frenzy. They began to fight each other for the safest spots on the raft, the center section, where one was less likely to be washed overboard by waves. In a brutal free-for-all, men stabbed, clubbed, and hurled each other into the ocean over a few feet of timber. Amid the moonless darkness, screams and the clash of blades rang out over the ceaseless roar of the surf. By the time the sun rose on the second day, the raft had become a floating charnel house. About 20 people lay dead, either murdered in the brawls, trampled to death, or lost to suicide and the sea during that first awful night. As if matters couldn't get any worse, nature herself assaulted the raft. Late that first night, a violent squall blew in over the waves. Furious winds and rain tore through the hapless survivors. Huge swells crashed onto the raft, sweeping several people into the depths and nearly overturning the fragile craft. In the chaos, the living trampled the dying. Some clung desperately to the raft's ropes, while others were washed away in the blackness. By dawn, the storm had passed, and yet more people had perished under its wrath. What little order remained on the raft completely broke down in the face of such terror. The following days brought little relief, only new depths of misery. By the fourth day, adrift of the roughly 150 souls who had originally embarked on the raft, only 67 were still alive. Starvation was setting in, and the survivors grew delirious with hunger and thirst. They had long since finished the last of the sodden biscuit paste. In desperation, some began chewing on strips of leather, belts, hats, scabbards, hoping to gain any bit of nutrients. Others gnawed on their linen shirts and clothing. Once, a small school of fish became trapped among the planks of the raft. The starving survivors managed to catch about 200 little fish with their bare hands and store them in an empty cask. They devoured them raw, eyes and all. But a few handfuls of tiny fish could not begin to ease their ravenous hunger. Then came the unthinkable. Faced with the absolute extremity of starvation, the survivors turned to the only meat left, the bodies of their own dead. Corpses that had been consigned to the waves were now hauled back onto the raft. With knives and razors, people began cutting strips of flesh from those who had already perished. Some wept as they did it. Others, maddened, showed no hesitation. The first reluctant bites were swallowed with gulps of wine to wash down the human flesh. Cannibalism had seized the raft of the Medusa. What had begun as a struggle for survival had become a descent into outright nightmare. By the second week, the survivors had been reduced to a kind of feral existence. Hope of rescue was almost gone. On the 8th day, with only wine dregs left to drink and a few strips of human jerky for food, the strongest of the group made a ruthless calculation. About 27 people remained, but many were badly injured, sick, or hallucinating. The healthier survivors concluded that if any of them were to survive, they needed to lighten the load and preserve the last of the supplies. In a grim pact, they decided to cast the weakest survivors overboard, one by one. The starving, emaciated men who could no longer fight back were grabbed and tossed into the sea by their comrades. Some went quietly, too delirious to understand. Others screamed and struggled until the ocean swallowed them whole. This horrifying culling was considered necessary to save the last few. It worked, in a sense. After this atrocity, only about 15 of the fittest men remained on the raft, and there was just enough wine left to sustain them a few more days. In the span of a little over a week, more than 100 had died, so that a handful might live. Day 13. The few who were still alive were scarcely human figures anymore. More like skeletons, with sunken, hollow eyes, muttering deliriously under the brutal sun. Then, sometime around the afternoon of July 17th, 1816, a shout rang out from one of the men. A ship, a sail on the horizon. The survivors scrambled to their feet, or those who still could, and scanned the distance. At first, many thought it was a hallucination, a final cruel trick of the mind. But no, it was real. A small brig appeared, growing clearer against the blue sky, summoning a last surge of strength. One man, a sailor, named Jean Charles, the only black crewman on the raft, climbed up and waved a white cloth frantically in the air. Others joined in as best they could, waving, yelling with parched throats. And by some miracle, the ship saw them. This was the French brig, Argus. One of the Medusa's companion ships now happened upon them entirely by chance. No one had actually been searching for the raft at all. The Argus drew closer, and the ordeal of the raft finally, mercifully, came to an end. Of the 147 people cast adrift, only 15 were still alive. 15 pitiful figures, nearly naked, their bodies blistered raw by the sun, and their minds and features marked by unspeakable suffering. When the sailors of the Argus pulled these wretches aboard, they were horrified. The survivors' hair had grown long and matted. Their beards were unkempt. Many were too weak to stand or even speak. The rescuers offered them water, wine, and broth, and carefully ferried them to the Senegalese shore to recover. Tragically, even after being saved, several of the survivors were too far gone. 5 of the 15 died in the days following their rescue, leaving only 10 to eventually return home alive. News of the Medusa tragedy sent shockwaves through France and the world. When the story got out, with its tales of cowardice, mutiny, cannibalism, and unimaginable suffering, it became an international scandal and a massive embarrassment for the French monarchy. The fact that an incompetent captain's arrogance had led to such horror, and that high-ranking officers had cut loose 150 people to die, outraged the public. Captain Chaumeries, incredibly, had even dispatched a salvage mission to recover gold from the wreck of the Medusa before any concerted effort was made to find the missing raft survivors. The incident symbolized everything that was wrong with nepotism and inept leadership. And what of Captain Chaumeries, the man at the helm of this disaster? He was indeed put on trial, a court-martial in 1817, where he faced charges for his actions. One might expect the punishment to fit the enormity of his failures, but in a rather farcical outcome, Chalmers was acquitted of the most serious charges, including abandoning the raft, and was found guilty merely of navigational negligence and abandoning his ship too soon. His sentence, 3 years in prison. Only 3 years. A slap on the wrist for causing the death of over 100 people and tarnishing France's reputation. Captain Chalmers spent barely more time behind bars than the survivors spent on that raft. The wreck of the Medusa and the saga of the Raft would leave an indelible mark on history. The survivors' harrowing testimonies were published and widely read, serving as a grim reminder of how quickly the thin veneer of civilization can peel away under desperation. For the French Navy and government, the affair was a lesson written in blood, a lesson about the cost of incompetence and blind favoritism. And for the rest of us, the story stands as a timeless cautionary tale of human fallibility and human endurance. It is the story of ordinary people pushed beyond the brink by extraordinary circumstances, a 13-day descent into madness that tested the limits of compassion, leadership, and survival. The Raft of the Medusa remains, to this day, a byword for both the darkest depths of human desperation and the faint glimmer of hope that refuses to die.